Many of you may have seen this image before. It's one of the most famous images in the struggle against human rights. It's of a slave ship called the Brooks. And it was exposed to the world by the Society for the Abolition of the Transatlantic Slave Trade at the beginning of the 19th century, end of the 18th century. And it was caused an enormous shock to people because it showed graphically for the first time just how people were stacked like livestock into the holds of the slave ships. Transatlantic slave trade was to slavery what the Holocaust is to genocide. It was the point in human history where the highest elements of industrialization were brought to bear on committing human rights violations. In 1787, a group of people got together and formed the Committee for the Abolition of the Transatlantic Slave Trade, and the American writer Adam Hochschild has described what their challenge was. It was equivalent to taking on an industry which had comparable power at the end of the 18th century to what the oil industry has today. And yet, within a period of a mere 20 years, they had brought an end to the transatlantic slave trade. Subsequent to that, slavery was abolished within the British Empire. And then this organization was established, which is Anti-Slavery International, the organization which I represent today. The chap standing up here with his finger in the air is a guy called Thomas Clarkson. Now, there's a famous story about Thomas Clarkson, which was that whenever he was a student at university, a little bit older than many of you here, he entered a competition to write in Latin. But the topic of the essay was on slavery. So he wrote an essay in Latin on slavery. And in the course of writing this, in order to demonstrate his skills in writing Latin, he became convinced that slavery was morally indefensible. And one day he was riding from Cambridge to London, and he stopped for a rest on from his horse, and he got off and he sat under a tree and thought to himself, well, if slavery is morally indefensible, it should be ended. And therefore, somebody should take responsibility for ending it. And Clarkson decided, well, he was somebody. So he started the organization of the Committee for the Abolition of the Transatlantic Slave Trade, gathering evidence in order to demonstrate just what the nature of the trade was, just what the human cost of the trade was, and slowly over time to wear down the resistance against slavery in order to end it. And they ended first the transatlantic slave trade, and then slavery itself within the British Empire, and then established this organization in order to campaign for slavery outside of the British Empire. This was involved in various things like putting an end to the Confederate Navy through the exposure of its financial assets in the UK. And then further on through time, it worked to expose things like the slavery which was used principally under the auspices of King Leopold of Belgium in order to harvest rubber from the Congo. The people you see here are missing their hands because if they didn't fulfill their quota for rubber from the colonial authorities, they had their hands chopped off. Here's another poor man looking at his hands he's been left with, which have been chopped off. Now, one of the things that was going on during this time was there was a myth that we lived with, the myth which my predecessors lived with, which was the idea if you could find one silver bullet, it would be enough to end slavery. So first of all, they struggled to end the transatlantic slave trade, thinking that would kill slavery. Secondly, they thought, well, if we make slavery illegal within the British Empire, that will end it. Then if we get legal abolition in the United States, that will also help. But each time slavery changed. Each time it became something a bit different. There is a line from English literature which says, treason doth never prosper. What's the reason? If it prospers, no one calls it treason. And the same is true for slavery. It continues to prosper because people don't call it slavery. People don't acknowledge it for what it is very often. This young man is in the fishing industry in Thailand. I don't know how many of you eat prawns or shrimp, but all those prawns and shrimp will come from supply chains which have been tainted by the forced labour, particularly of Cambodian and Burmese and Lao migrants into the Thai fishing industry. This represents cocoa. And there's much child labour and much child slavery within the cocoa sector across West Africa, so each of us who are eating a chocolate bar are eating something which is the product of slavery or child labour. The brick kilns across South Asia are legendary, notorious for the use of slavery and bonded labour within them, where people are forced to pay back small loans they've taken, maybe for marriage, maybe to buy medicine, maybe to pay for a funeral, with their own labour, which is undervalued, and the loans have an enormous interest rate put on them, so they become almost impossible to pay off. And if you ever work in South Asia, some of you may, and you sit in an office which has been built with bricks, the bricks have probably been produced by slavery. Today, there's about 21 million people in forced labour or slavery across the world. The number is almost certainly higher than that because nobody acknowledges forced child marriage as being a system of slavery itself, where children are ripped out of school and sold off for sexual exploitation under the guise of marriage. I suppose each of us have in our pockets today mobile phones. At the heart of the mobile phone is two minerals. One's called coltan and another's called cobalt. Those minerals are drawn from the mines of Central Africa around Congo, and very often they're produced by child slave labour as well. If you don't have a mobile phone, you probably are wearing a garment which is made with cotton, and the cotton harvest from Central Asia is overwhelmingly uses state-sponsored forced labour in order to produce it. And then whenever it gets to the spinning mills of South Asia, particularly southern India, it's used in order, the forced labour of girls and young women is used in order to spin that into thread. This might sound a bit abstract, it might sound a bit distant, so I'll tell you just one story about that. We did a piece of research on this issue a few years ago, and in the course of that we interviewed the mother of one young woman who was working in a spinning mill, spinning cotton into thread. And she told us that she'd gone to see her daughter, and she'd said, she'd seen that her daughter was ill. She said, "How ill are you?" And her daughter explained she had a very high fever, she was vomiting, so she went to see the factory manager and said, "Please, can I take my daughter home? She's ill. I need to take her home until she gets better, and I'll send her back after that." But the factory manager says, "No, we can't do that. We've too much work here. We can't spare anybody from leaving, but we'll take care of your daughter. Don't worry about that." So she left her daughter in the factory and went home, and 2 weeks later she got a phone call, a message from the factory saying, "Actually, you can collect your daughter now. She's dead." She was 20 years old. People were worked to death in the fields of the Americas in the 19th century. They're still being worked to death across the world today. They're being worked to death in the spinning mills of South Asia, in the cobalt mines of Central Africa, in the fishing fleets of Thailand, in the servants' quarters of many of the cities of Europe, which also have slavery within them. I'll go back to that line I said, "Treason doth never prosper." Slavery prospers still because, to all intents and purposes, across the world, it's legal. It's not called slavery. It's called other things. It's called something like the sponsorship system that is used for migrant workers, mostly South Asians, in the construction industry of the Gulf, which means that the World Cup of 2022 in Qatar is likely to be produced with the forced labour of tens of thousands of South Asian workers. And the International Trade Union Confederation estimates that 4,000 people are going to die before a single ball is kicked in those construction projects. That will make the Qatar 2022 World Cup possibly the bloodiest sporting event since Augustus Caesar organised gladiatorial games for the entertainments of the masses in Rome 2,000 years ago. I just caught the end of what the last speaker was saying, and I thought it was very important because it is resonates with this issue. If slavery is legal, then it requires the actions of committed citizens in order to respond to that. Education is fundamental to breaking the cycle of slavery. And yet, so many children across the world, particularly girls, particularly from discriminated groups like Dalits across South Asia, are denied access to education. And when they get access to education, the education quality is very poor. There's little in that which empowers children for the future, particularly empowers girls, particularly extends the knowledge of girls' rights and human rights, particularly gives kids the capacity in order to turn those ideas into action, particularly gives them the capacity to get decent work, particularly gives them the capacity to start businesses for themselves. The denial of these options for children across the world is a political issue. This is an issue which I hope will concern young people, and young people will take action on. This isn't about being a consumer in what you buy. It's about making your elected representatives listen to you, making your political leaders listen to you, and change the way in which they do development policy and aid policy across the world in order to open up access to quality education for kids across the world. And in the places in West Africa and South Asia where we have been involved in getting kids who are vulnerable to slavery from communities that have been exploited in slavery, getting them into education, we have seen enormous changes, breaking the cycles of slavery across generations and bringing new empowered citizens into the societies and the citizenry of their countries. One young woman said that, "I've learned to express myself better in public and speak up for women's rights." There's an ideology goes around at the moment which is saying, well, we should all stand up for ourselves. It's only half right. We should stand up for each other. And education helps us do that. And those who are often denied education are denied education because the powerful in their societies don't want them to stand up for themselves or for each other. There's still 21 million people enslaved today. As I said, there's more than 21 million people enslaved today. And each of us are implicated in those systems of slavery, whether we want to be or not. So there's a challenge for all of us in terms of what sort of role do we want to play in this struggle for justice, and indeed all the other struggles for justice which are going on today. Each of us, I think, needs to answer the question that Clarkson posed to himself 200 years ago, which is, if this is morally wrong, somebody should do something about this. And each of us is a somebody who should do something about this. You may not have an ideal or an ambition to be working in human rights all your life. That's fine. You may want to be a business executive or a teacher or a lawyer or a musician or an artist. That's great. But as you get older and you come through life, each of you will find that you have some power at some different times in your life in order to affect change and to change the lives of others, whether it's through writing to your MP, writing to your member of parliament, writing to your political leader, becoming a political leader, or making certain choices within the businesses that you work with in order to decide whether or not you're going to do something which increases the power of poor people who are vulnerable to slavery or other human rights abuses, or exploits that lack of power that they have. Each of us is somebody. Each of us can do something about this. All that's required is the audacity of ambition to act. And there'll be many reasons not to act. There'll be what everybody else is doing and everybody else's disinterest in these issues. And that's when the courage that the previous speaker talked about, that's when that courage becomes important. to be prepared to raise your voice whenever those around you are not or interested or are ignorant of what the fundamental issues are in terms of human rights situations in which we find ourselves. It's not easy to do, but it's important to do. There was an Irish human rights activist at the beginning of the 20th century. He was one of the people who was involved in exposing the brutality of King Leopold in the Congo. And he has the distinction, the notoriety of having been the last knight of the realm to have been executed for high treason in Britain, which was for a different piece of his career in relation to the Irish revolutions. But one of the things he said at one point in his career was this. He was working in Cameroon, and he came across a situation where 27 Cameroonian soldiers who were in the service of the German state were about to be executed with their wives. And the reason for this was they had mutinied whenever their wives had been whipped and tortured by the colonial authorities. And Casement wrote a line at that point, which I thought was quite important. He said, "We all on earth have a commission and a right to defend the weak against the strong and to protest against brutality in any shape or form." That's a commission which I think we all hold today. The question that faces us then is whether we are going to act on that commission, whether we are going to campaign for the weak against the strong, campaign to protest against the injustices where we see them, where we encounter them, using the power that we have in order to end them when we can. It's a big challenge, but we can all do small bits of it. The introduction to me here today said, I've fought against slavery all over the world. There's some truth in that. I haven't done it alone. Right across the world, there's anti-slavery activists who are putting their lives on the line day in, day out in order to advance the cause of justice across the world. None of us individually, or few of us, would ever have the power to bend history. But collectively, in the words of Bobby Kennedy, through numberless diverse acts of courage and belief, we can shape the history of these times. And the other thing to remember is that whenever we act together, it doesn't matter how flawed we are, how diverse we are, what our motives are, or what the power of those ranged against us are, or what their disinterest is, or what their brutality is like. If we together, with all our great diversity, still choose to act in the name of justice, together, still, we can overcome. Thank you.